As part of the Headstrong documentary, NBC Sports regional networks have also produced several pieces highlighting the work of mental health professionals in our local communities. One such person that we featured here in DC is mental performance coach Brian Levenson, who helps athletes reach their full potential.
I'm Brian Levenson. I work as a mental performance coach.
I call it your mistake response. Can you snap recover?
And mental performance coaches work with athletes on the mental side of performance. We don't work with people that have a clinical disorder. We work with people who say, hey, part of my sport or part of my performance is mental. Why don't I work on that? And we can train the physical, we can train the technical, and we can train the mental. If you think about it, you've got these physical and these technical skills. The mental is what unlocks potential. So we often say that the inner game will run the outer game. And so your inner game will determine how you do at developing and cultivating and then executing those outer skills. Many athletes will tell me when they're at their best, it's pretty calm, it's pretty clear, they are mentally tight and physically loose. How you get yourself back to that space is different for every athlete. One size doesn't fit all. And so we have a discussion and a conversation about what they look like when they're at their best, and also acknowledging what they look like when they're struggling. And then we create systems and tools and processes and routines and habits to help them get into that space more often.
Curl and drag to the front. Poke check by Holtby.
Everything he does before he even steps on the ice, he often goes to the bench and visualizes exactly how he wants to play and what he wants to do and sees himself out there. After he lets a goal in, he'll grab the Gatorade bottle, squirt himself, and then reset. We'll use words to talk to himself, to get himself back into that net, so that when that puck's coming flying again, and by the way, in hockey, it's gonna come really quickly, that he's ready. So let's use Max Scherzer. We're in Washington, D.C. You can see Max talking to himself, but then you might see somebody like Anthony Rendon where you don't see it outwardly, but inwardly, he's probably having a dialogue with himself. This should be something that we're all working on. We're all looking to be our best selves, and why wouldn't we work on our mindset and set our mind to be the best we can possibly be, to perform at the level that we need to be at? At the end of the day, we're trying to get them to be as present as possible so they're not too worried about the past, which is a lot of times where depression lies, and not too worried about the future, which is where anxiety lies, but simply be where their feet are and be in that space of presence.
And we are lucky enough to have Brian join us here in the living room. Thank you so much for being here. I loved in that piece, you said you help athletes unlock their full potential. Explain what your role is and what you do.
Yeah, so I get hired by athletes, I get hired by people outside of sports as well to help them with their mindset, help them with their mentality so that they can be their best selves. And so for some, that means scoring a basketball or hitting a baseball. And for others, it could be what we're doing on set right now. Try to think about what my mindset needs to be, how I need to present myself, and how I need to perform. So I work in between the ears, and that's my job.
I loved when you mentioned Anthony Rendon. I had a conversation with one of the Nats coaches this year where they said, look at Anthony, you'll never see him show any emotion. When you see an athlete like that who seems to always be calm, who seems to never really react one way or the other, what does that tell you? And does that mean that a guy is in a good mental headspace, or could that be deceiving?
Yeah, I think emotions are really interesting and tricky. We all have them. So we work off emotion. We work off how we feel. And you can play with emotion without being emotional. So when you see someone like Anthony, you notice how present he is, how calm he is. I think there was even a moment in the playoffs where he went up to his manager and felt his chest. And I think a lot of coaches, a lot of people look at Anthony and say, yeah, that's what I want. But there are other athletes that bring emotion. We talked about Max Scherzer in that piece, who plays with some emotion. And I think the key is not whether they are even or not, it's about where they need to be and how they need to get there. So there's something called the inverted U theory, which suggests that, you know, emotionally we can be at a 1 or we can be at a 10. And that we all have this optimal place that we want to be at. And for someone like Anthony, it might be closer to a 2 or a 3. And for someone like Scherzer, it might be at like a 7 or an 8. And the other piece is depending on what our job is. So someone like Ray Lewis, for example, might need to be a little higher on that level. And a kicker, for example, Matt Stover is who I remember watching with the Ravens. Maybe he needs to be a little calmer. So I'm not a fan of saying you have to be like Anthony or you have to be like Max, but I think it's important that you know what you need to be at your best self.
You hear this discussion in sports all the time, whether it's at the high school, collegiate, or on the pro level, that athletes say the game is mental. Could you kind of explain what they mean by that and what that means as far as your participation?
Yeah, and I've worked with high school athletes, college athletes, and pro athletes. And a lot of times when you ask those athletes what part of your game is mental and what part is physical, and you ask them the percentages, the higher you go, the more elite the athlete, the more they'll talk about the mental. So they might say in high school it's 50-50. And then in college you might hear 75-25 mental. Then when you get to the pros, a lot of times they say, oh, it's 99%. I think what they really mean by that is they know how to train physically, they know how to train technique, and when they get to that level, they're working on those things all the time. And what will unlock the physical and what will unlock the technical is the mental side of it. So as you get better and better at something, the physical and the technical you build, you know how to do it, but the mental can get in the way and can also help us thrive.
You were talking about it there, but athletes, of course, they have that physical ability, but to get mentally ready, can you give us a little insight? What do you do? What tips do you have for these athletes? What do you give them to kind of unlock that potential in them?
Yeah, so I think there are tools and techniques that we can use, and we talk about those tools and techniques in sports psychology. And then there's the other piece, which is finding out what works for each person. So I'll go into the tools and techniques because that's what you asked about. Visualization is a tool you hear every 4 years in the Olympics. Gymnasts will use visualization. Michael Phelps would use visualization in the pool.
Braden Holtby watches the whole game before it starts.
Right, he's visualizing on the sideline and watching, or on the bench and watching the game and how it might seem. Mike Camilleri is another hockey player who will use visualization. So visualization is a common tool that a lot of athletes use to perform. We talk about self-talk a lot. What's the dialogue you have with yourself? How are you talking to yourself?
If you don't say it, you're not going to believe it and it won't come true.
Yeah, and I won't even go that far. I'll just say, hey, what you're saying to yourself matters. And there's a difference between thoughts and thinking. Thoughts are what comes in. We don't necessarily control our thoughts. During this conversation, I've already had thoughts of doubt or thoughts of not natural. It's going to happen. You're going to have thoughts that are not going to be helpful. So your ability to acknowledge those thoughts, accept them, be aware of them, but shift your attention to how you talk to yourself and really take advantage of your self-talk and that inner dialogue, that's what really drives behavior.
Brian, thank you so much for joining us in the living room. We've seen Headstrong. It's been a whole week, of leading up to this, but I've learned so much in just this conversation. So thanks again for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So make sure to stick around right after this because there will be an encore performance of Headstrong after we are done. Our documentary that looks at how prominent athletes are helping us to remove the stigma from mental health issues and find solutions. Watch Headstrong next, right after this, on NBC Sports Washington, presented locally by Innovation Health.